Good morning, everybody. Our today's class is on basic tissues of body. The learning objectives for my today's class are: I will be describing tissues of the body under following headings: nomenclature or classification of the tissues, structure and organization or arrangement of the tissues, and functions of the four basic tissues of our body. Let's first go to the definition of a tissue. It is defined as groups of cells with a common structure and function. There are four basic tissues of our body, named as epithelial tissue, connective tissue, muscular tissue, and nervous tissue. To begin with, let's enter inside the dissection hall and take a section of the upper limb. Like other parts of the body, limb is also covered by skin. Skin has got three layers: epidermis, dermis, and hypodermis. Epidermis is composed of epithelial tissue, which in case of skin is stratified squamous keratinized epithelium. Now, if you give an incision in the skin and enter the subcutaneous tissue, below the skin there is a layer of loose connective tissue. This is also called a subcutaneous tissue or loose connective tissue, or also as loose areolar tissue. Loose connective tissue. In this connective tissue there are subcutaneous nerves, vessels, which include arteries, veins, and lymphatic, in addition to the adipose tissue. Given incision in the deep fascia of the limb, we come across various groups of the muscles which are attached to the bones. These are skeletal muscles and constitute the muscular tissue. Bone is an example of dense connective tissue. Bones of the upper limb articulated at various joints. Muscles are attached to the bones, but each muscle is innervated by nerves. Nerves come from the brachial plexus, or we can say they come from the central nervous system. Thus, these muscles are under control of the central nervous system through nerves. Electrical impulses from the central nervous system make these nerves to contract. They act on the joints to perform some action, for example, flexion and extension at the elbow joint, which is brought about by biceps and triceps respectively. The ends of these bones at joints are lined by the cartilage, which is also an example of connective tissue. Another example of the connective tissue is blood, which carries nutrients to various parts of the body. Thus, upper limb is covered by the skin, which is lined by stratified squamous keratinized epithelium. Below the epithelium, loose connective tissue in the form of subcutaneous or loose areolar tissue. Deeper to that, we have dense connective tissue. After giving incision in the dense connective tissue, muscles form third type of tissue, which is bones articulate with each other to form joints. Bone is an example of dense connective tissue. These muscles are innervated by the nerves, which make them to contract and act on the joint. As a whole, upper limb is composed of four basic tissues as already discussed. Now let us take a section of the small intestine. What is the general plan of the gastrointestinal tract? Gastrointestinal tract throughout is formed of four layers. Innermost layer is mucosa. Below the mucosa there is submucosa. Below the submucosa we have muscular layer. The muscles here, or smooth muscles, they are arranged as in a circular and outer longitudinal layers. Then outer to that is serosa. Serosa is basically visceral peritoneum. In case of intestine, mucosa is composed of columnar epithelium. Below the mucosa, there is submucosa. In the submucosa, we find connective tissue, blood vessels, and nerves. These nerves form a submucosal plexus. In addition to that, there are also lymphatic vessels. Deeper to that, there is layer of smooth muscle, which is composed of inner circular and outer longitudinal layers. Between these muscular layers, there is plexus of the nerve called the myelin plexus, which are basically autonomic nerves responsible for peristalsis. Outer to this longitudinal layer, there is covering of serosa, which is basically connective tissue. In short, in whole gut, there are also four types of tissues: epithelial tissue, connective tissue, muscular tissue, and nervous tissue. The epithelial tissue in case of small gut is columnar epithelium. Connective tissue is again loose connective tissue. Then muscular tissue is smooth muscle. The small intestine is also composed of these four tissues: epithelial, connective, nervous, and muscular tissue. As shown in this diagram, the innermost layer, that is mucosa, then submucosa containing glands and also the nerves, then inner circular and outer longitudinal muscle layers, which is composed of smooth muscle. Then there is visceral peritoneum. Between the circular and longitudinal layers, there is myelin plexus of nerves, which control the activities of the smooth muscle. Now let us take a section of blood vessel. As you know from the pre-medical knowledge, blood vessel is basically composed of three layers. Innermost layer is called the tunica intima, which is composed of simple squamous epithelium. Outer to that, tunica media, which is composed of the muscular tissue or elastic tissue depending upon the type of the vessel. Then outer to that, there is adventitia, which is the third layer of the blood vessel. Now in adventitial layer, we have connective tissue and nerves. Thus, in total, there are four tissues in blood vessel also: epithelial tissue, muscular tissue, connective tissue, and nervous tissue. The nerves which supply the blood vessel are called vasa nervosa, and the vessels which supply blood vessel are called vasa vasorum. Now let us take a section of the heart to see its structure. Heart is basically modified blood vessel. It is composed of three layers: inner endocardium, middle myocardium, and outer epicardium. Now, endocardium is composed of epithelial tissue, myocardium is composed of the cardiac muscle, and in epicardium we have connective tissue and also blood vessels and nerves of the heart. The heart is also composed of these four basic tissues, that is epithelial tissue, connective tissue, nervous and muscular tissue. Now let me ask you a question. What is vasa vasorium? Why vasa vasorium is well developed in a vein than artery? Vasa vasorium is basically blood vessel supplying a blood vessel. This is more developed in case of vein than artery. The reason being that veins contain deoxygenated blood in their lumen, so less diffusion of oxygen and nutrients takes place from lumen towards the outer layers of the vessel. In contrast, arteries contain oxygenated blood, so diffusion takes place from the lumen of the artery towards the outer layers of the vessel. As a result of it, the veins need more vascular supply than arteries. So the vasa vasorum is well developed in veins as compared to arteries. Let us discuss the structure of the epidermis. What are the various layers of epidermis? As already said, skin is composed of epidermis, dermis, and hypodermis. In epidermis, there is stratified squamous epithelium. Now, if we look inside the epithelium, it is composed of stratum basale or the basal layer, which is columnar. Stratum spinosum is the next layer. Stratum granulosum, so called because of the presence of the granules inside the cell. Stratum lucidium, because it appears white, so we called it as lucidium. Stratum corneum is a layer of keratin. Cells without nuclei but filled with keratin constitute the stratum corneum. And the question is whether cells are the basal layer or columnar, and at the topmost layer they are composed of keratin. If we see the vascular supply of these epidermis, it comes from the deeper layer. Cells in the basal layer, they are columnar, they need more nutrients. So the basal layer is columnar and it is metabolically active as it lies closer to the blood vessels. In contrast, if we go from basal towards the apical layer, the shape of these cells changes. Simple squamous cells being least active metabolically, we find them away from the blood vessels and ultimately these cells die out. What is epithelial tissue? It is an avascular tissue that covers exterior of the body surfaces, for example skin. It also lines the body cavities including vascular system and body tubes that communicate with the exterior. For example, gastrointestinal tract from oral cavity up to the anal canal, respiratory and also genitourinary tract. Epithelium also forms the secretory portion of glands, that's parenchyma, and lines their ducts. Specialized form of epithelial cells function as receptors for spatial sensing. For what are the various body cavities lined by the epithelium? Various cavities lined by epithelium are cranial cavity, vertebral cavity, pleural cavity, pericardial cavity, peritoneal cavity, and pelvic cavity. What are the various functions of the epithelium? Epithelium protects us from outside world. For example, second, it performs many functions. Broadly, we say it protects underlying tissues. Absorption. Epithelial cells in the stomach and intestine perform the function of absorption. In the kidney, the epithelium performs the function of filtration. In kidney, the epithelium lining the glomeruli performs the function of filtration of blood. The epithelial lining of the glands is secretory in function. Now, what are the characteristics of the epithelium? Epithelium is loosely attached to each other, forming a protective barrier. Epithelial cells always have one free surface which is open to the outside or inside an internal organ. Always has one free or apical surface which is open to outside the body or inside an internal organ. Always had one fixed basal section attached to the underlying connective tissue. Has no blood vessels but can soak up nutrients from blood vessels in connective tissue underneath. Epithelium can have lots of nerves in it. Epithelium is very good at regenerating. How do we classify the epithelium? By the shape of the cells. For example, squamous, they are shaped like the flat thylacine or scales of fish. Cuboidal epithelium, they are as tall as wide. And columnar epithelium, they are tall column-shaped epithelial cells. By cell arrangement, simple epithelium, it is composed of single layer of the cells. All of them are attached to the basement membrane. Stratified epithelium is also called the multi-layered epithelium, as is found in mouth and skin. Based on the shape, the squamous epithelium, which is just like the tiles of floor, cuboidal epithelium, where the height of the and breadth of the cells is same, and columnar epithelium, where cells are taller than broader, so breadth is less than the height of cells. Squamous epithelium is less active metabolically. Cuboidal epithelium is usually found in the ducts of the glands, and columnar epithelium is found in those parts of the body where the function is either absorption or secretion, for example, in gastrointestinal tract. As shown in this diagram, squamous epithelium can be single-layered, where all cells are attached to the basement membrane. We call it as simple squamous epithelium. Then cuboidal epithelium, cells are cuboidal in shape and all cells are attached to the basement membrane. We call it as simple cuboidal epithelium. Then columnar epithelium is simple columnar, where cells are columnar in shape and all cells are attached to the basement membrane. In stratified epithelium, epithelium is multiple layered. Only the basal cells are attached to the basement membrane. Now, depending on the topmost layer, we name this stratified epithelium as stratified squamous epithelium, because in this case the topmost layer is squamous in shape. Stratified cuboidal is multi-layered cuboidal epithelium, where cuboidal epithelium is present on the topmost layer. Stratified columnar epithelium is multi-layered columnar epithelium, but topmost layers are also columnar in shape. What is the difference between pseudostratified and stratified? In pseudostratified epithelium, they appear as multi-layered because the nuclei of these cells are at different levels, as shown in this diagram. So nuclei are at different levels, but all the cells are attached to the basement membrane. They appear as stratified, but actually it is a single layer of the epithelium with nuclei at different levels, giving it a stratified experience. Location of the epithelium. Why we have different types of epithelium in different parts of the body. Simple squamous epithelial tissue. So this type of epithelium is found in those parts of the body where the function is diffusion. For example, in lungs, alveoli are lined by simple squamous epithelium because they allow diffusion of air from alveoli to blood. Cuboidal epithelium is found in the kidney tubules and also in the ducts of glands. Simple columnar epithelium is found in those parts of the body where the function is either absorption or secretion, for example, in the gut. Pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium is found in the trachea because these cilia remove mucus which is trapped by the mucus produced by the goblet cells towards the nasal cavity. Stratified squamous epithelial tissue, multilayered epithelium tissue, its function is protection. So it is found in the oral cavity. It is also found in the esophagus. Stratified cuboidal epithelium tissue. This type of epithelium is found in salivary glands and sweat glands. Stratified columnar epithelial tissue is found in the male reproductive tract. Transitional epithelium is also called the urothelium. It is found in the urinary bladder. Now, what is transitional epithelium? In the previous section, we described simple epithelium composed of groups of the cells where all cells are attached to the basement membrane. On the other hand, we had stratified epithelium, which is composed of multiple layers of the epithelial cells, but here only one layer, that is the basal, is attached to the basement membrane. In case of certain viscera, for example, urinary bladder, when the bladder is distended, the number of epithelial layers decreases. But when the same bladder is contracted after the passage of the urine, what happens? The number of epithelial layers increases. In a distended bladder, the number of epithelial layers is 3 to 4, where it is 6 to 8 in case of a contracted bladder, where this epithelial is thrown into folds called trabeculae. So there is transition. In distended state, we have less number of the epithelial layers, while as in contracted state, there are more layer of cells. That is why it is called the transitional. Why it is called transitional epithelium? epithelium as already explained. Number of cell layers changes with the distension and contraction as shown in this diagram. Normally, when the bladder is contracted, the number of layers is 6 to 8, but when the bladder is distended or stretched, number of layers decreases from 6 to 8 to 3 to 4. That is why we call it as transitional epithelium. So, what are the various functions of the epithelium? Protection, since it covers all exposed surface of the body. For example, second, it lines the body cavities like peritoneal and pelvic cavity. Absorption in gut, for example, in intestine and stomach. Filtration as it occurs in glomerulus. Excretion as occurs in kidney. Secretion forms endocrine and exocrine glands. Sensory reception, olfactory mucosa is an example. Why do you find different types of epithelium at different sites of the body? In the second, the function of the epithelium is protection. So we have stratified squamous keratinoid epithelium. Other derivatives of the keratin, they are scales in fishes, spines in certain animals, hairs and nails, they are also derived from keratin. Horns in case of animals. Now in the small intestine, the epithelium is tall columnar because the function is either absorption or secretion. This tall columnar epithelium is thrown into the folds. This is to increase the surface area for absorption. In olfactory mucosa, the function of the epithelium is olfaction. So depending upon the function, we have different types of epithelium in different parts of the body. For example, in esophagus, it is stratified squamous because the function is protection. In nasal mucosa, we have olfactory epithelium because the function is olfaction. We have pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium, which is also called the respiratory epithelium because the function is the cilia take out dust trapped in mucus from the respiratory passage. In kidney, the function is absorption. We have the tubular epithelium is simple cuboidal. Metabolically, the epithelium can be classified, columnar being the most active. Squamous epithelium is least active, while as cuboidal epithelium is intermediate between columnar and squamous epithelium. Now let us take an example of the second. Case of second, epidermis is composed of basal layer, and then second layer is stratum spinosum or prickle cell layer. Then we have the granular cell layer. Above the granular cell there is stratum lucidium. Then above that is stratum corneum. Now if we concentrate on the blood supply of the skin, and the blood supply of the epidermis comes from the deeper layers. So those layers which are metabolically active, that is the basal layer or columnar layer, it receives more nutrition. As we go from basal to the apical layers, we see being away from nutrients, these epithelial cells change their shape. Initially, the basal layer is columnar, then we have the supintal sepal cell, then gradually the shape of the cell changes towards the squamous type because squamous being the least active metabolically, and finally after loss of blood supply, these cells form the keratin, which is a dead tissue. The second tissue of our body is muscular tissue. As shown in this diagram, muscles can be skeletal muscle, which are attached to the bones, cardiac muscle, which is found in the heart, and smooth muscle, which is found inside the gut. Skeletal muscle is also called the voluntary. It is because it is under the control of the will. Smooth muscle is called involuntary because it is not under voluntary control. Now, in between the two, there is cardiac muscle, which is striated. Thus, it resembles the skeletal muscle histologically, but at the same time, it is not under the voluntary control, so it resembles the smooth muscle. The basic function of the muscle is contraction. What are the effects of the contraction? Skeletal muscle contraction. It helps us in performing various activities. It helps us in locomotion. So smooth muscle of the gut contracts to produce peristalsis, whereas the cardiac muscle contracts, it ejects blood into blood vessels. As shown in this diagram, so there are three types of muscular tissue: skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, and smooth muscle tissue. Skeletal is attached to the bones, cardiac present in the heart, and smooth is present in the various viscera of our body. Skeletal and cardiac, they are called striated because of their histological appearance. Striated muscle on one side being skeletal muscle is voluntary in control because it is supplied by the somatic nerve. Cardiac muscle, though striated, is involuntary because it is supplied by the autonomic nerves. Smooth muscle differs from the two. One, in its appearance because it is smooth in appearance. Number two, it is not under the voluntary control, so it does not resemble the skeletal muscle in its innervation. So histologically, muscular tissue can be striated and smooth. In striated, we have cardiac muscle and skeletal muscle. In smooth, we have muscles of gastrointestinal tract. As shown in this table, the three types of the muscular tissue are skeletal muscle attached to the bones, moves the bones. Here the cells are multinucleated and it appears striated. It is under voluntary control. The cardiac muscle is present in the heart, pumps the blood. During systole, cardiac myocytes have only one nucleus. They are striated appearance and are superficial feature of this cardiac myocytes is intercalated discs. Unlike skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle is involuntary. The visceral or smooth muscle, it is found in the various organs. For example, whole of the gastrointestinal tract. The contraction of this smooth muscle produces peristalsis. There is one nucleus and no striations, so it is non-striated and it is also involuntary. Third important tissue of the body is the connective tissue. Connective tissue is the most abundant and widely distributed tissue of our body. It binds together parts of the body. It gives us protection and support. This type of tissue is the most abundant, widespread and varied of all tissue types in body. It also has the widest variety of function. Examples of the connective tissue is loose connective tissue, which is found in the subcutaneous tissue, areolar tissue, also called adipose tissue. And bone is an example of dense connective tissue. Cartilage is also an example of connective tissue. Cartilages are of three types: hyaline, elastic, and fibrocartilage. Now the question is, where do we find connective tissue in the body? What are the different types of connective tissue? If we take a section of lower limb, what do we find there? So after reflecting the second, there is areolar tissue. In the loose areolar tissue, we have adipose tissue. This is an example of connective tissue. This loose areolar tissue also contains elastic, reticular, and collagen fibers. They are also examples of connective tissue. Within these fibers, we find various types of the cells which also contribute to the connective tissue. Bone is an example of dense connective tissue. Cartilage, which lines the ends of the bones which form a joint, is also an example of connective tissue. Blood is also a connective tissue which is composed of fluid and cells. And the characteristics of connective tissue are it is very vascular, that is, it is rich in blood supply. Exceptions where it is less vascular are tendons, ligaments, and cartilages. The blood supply of the connective tissue is greater than that of the epithelial tissue. It is made of many types of specialized cells. It contains large amount of non-living material referred to as the matrix, which is composed of ground substance and fibers. Typically, this material is manufactured and secreted by cells of the specific connective tissue. How do we classify connective tissue? Connective tissue is classified into the four groups. Connective tissue proper, which includes loose connective tissue, examples of which are areolar tissue, adipose tissue, and reticular tissue. It also includes dense connective tissue, which can be dense regular, dense irregular, or elastic. Second type of connective tissue is cartilage. Cartilages are of three types: hyaline, elastic, and fibro. Third type of connective tissue is called osseous connective tissue, which includes the bone. And fourth type of connective tissue is blood. What is the composition of the connective tissue? What forms the connective tissue? It is composed of cells, which include fibroblasts, plasma cells, mast cells, adipocytes, macrophages, eosinophils, lymphocytes, mast cells. In addition to the cells, there are fibers, which include collagen, elastic, and reticular fibers. The functions of the connective tissue are enclosing and separating organs, connecting tissues to one another, supporting and moving joints and cartilages, storage, for example, fat, which acts as a storage of energy. It insulates our body. It also protects us from cold. Transport and protection. For example, blood. It transports nutrients from heart towards the tissues and also oxygen from lungs towards the tissues. Protection. For example, cranium. It protects the brain and it is covering us. The fourth tissue of our body is nervous tissue. This tissue is very important because of its functions. It controls and coordinates all activities of the body. The basic structural unit of the nervous tissue is a neuron. As you know, there are 1 trillion neurons in the human brain. Conductivity is the special property of the nervous tissue. This tissue conducts impulses from one part of the body to other. In addition to the neurons, there are also neuroglia or supporting cells present in the nervous tissue. Basic structural unit of the nervous tissue is a neuron, which consists of a soma or a body, dendrites or processes arising from the soma, and axon. One of the processes is larger that we called as the axon. In addition to the neuron, Other cells present in the nervous tissue are astrocytes, oligodendrocytes. How nervous tissue is organized in our body? Nervous tissue is divided into central and peripheral nervous system. Central nervous system includes brain and spinal cord, while the peripheral nervous system includes autonomic nervous system and somatic nervous system. Somatic nervous system consists of cranial and spinal nerves. There are 12 pairs of the cranial nerves arising from the brain and 31 pairs of spinal nerves arising from the spinal cord. The autonomic nervous system is further divided into sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. Now, what is peripheral nervous system? As already said, peripheral nervous system is divided into autonomic nervous system and somatic nervous system. Somatic nervous system includes cranial and spinal nerves. There are 12 pairs of cranial and 31 pairs of spinal nerves respectively. Autonomic nervous system is divided into sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. What is a spinal and a cranial nerve? So cranial nerves are 12 pairs in number. They arise from the brain, while as the nerves arising from the spinal cord are called spinal nerves. They are 31 pairs in number. A pair of spinal nerves arises from each segment of spinal cord. Each spinal nerve has a ventral and dorsal root. So these nerves arise by root lattice from each segment of the spinal cord. These root lattice join to form ventral and dorsal root. Ventral root carries motor fibers, whereas dorsal root carries sensory fibers. Dorsal root contains this dorsal root ganglion, which has a central process which carries information toward the spinal cord, and a peripheral process which collects information from the ventral and dorsal root joined together to form a mixed trunk. This mixed trunk divides into ventral and dorsal ramus. The nerve fibers from the spinal nerves, so they go from the central nervous system to their target organs without interruption in case of somatic nervous system. From each segment of the spinal cord, we have ventral and dorsal rootlets. Ventral rootlets are motor, whereas the dorsal rootlets are sensory. The ventral and dorsal rootlets join together to form a trunk which is mixed. This trunk divides into ventral ramus and a dorsal ramus. Ventral ramus supplies the anterolateral body wall, whereas the dorsal ramus supplies the paraspinal muscles and overlying skin. The autonomic nervous system and the endocrine system control internal environment of the body. They provide a fine discrete control over the functions of many organs and tissues of the body, including cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and exocrine glands. In brief, sympathetic nervous system prepares an individual for emergency responses. There is quick mobilization pattern, utilization of the resources, and redistribution. In contrast, the response produced by the parasympathetic nervous system is called a rest and digest response. It conserves and restores body energy. It increases the digestive and urinary function, decreases body functions that support physical activity. Now, what is the basic difference between the autonomic and somatic nerve? As shown in this diagram, from CNS information comes by preganglionic nerve fibers into a ganglion. Ganglion is basically a collection of nerve fibers. What happens from this ganglion? Impulse comes from central nervous system. It gets interrupted at the level of ganglion. From level of ganglion, it is carried by the postganglionic fibers. But the ratio of pre and postganglionic fibers is 1 is to 164. That means for every preganglionic fiber, we have 164 postganglionic fibers, resulting anatomically in the formation of the ganglion, and at the same time, interruption and dispersion of the information which comes from central nervous system to target organ. So the basic difference between somatic and autonomic nervous system is that in somatic nervous system, information comes directly from central nervous system to the target organ, whereas in case of autonomic nervous system, the information which comes from the nervous system by preganglionic fiber is relayed in the ganglion, so there is an interruption. Secondly, there is dispersion because for each preganglionic fiber we have 164 postganglionic nerve fibers which carry this information and also disseminate it in the sympathetic nervous system. As shown in this diagram, the preganglionic fibers they relay in the ganglion, and from there this information is carried by the postganglionic fibers. Another important thing is this information gets disseminated at the level of ganglion through postganglionic nerve fibers as shown in this diagram. Whereas in the somatic nervous system, the information comes directly from central nervous system to the target organ. For example, in case of neuromuscular junction, the neurofiber which innervates neuromuscular junction. In addition to axons, the other types of the cells which are found in the central nervous system, they are called as supporting cells of nervous system. The supporting cell, they are neuroglia in central nervous system. Nervous system is divided into central and peripheral nervous system. In the central nervous system, we have astrocytes, oligodendrocytes, ependymal cells, and microglial cells. In the peripheral nervous system, they are in the form of satellite cells or capsular cells and Schwann cells. In summary, there are four basic tissues in our body: epithelial tissue, connective tissue, muscular, and nervous tissue. Each tissue has different structure and function. These tissues are anatomically organized in various strata in different organs. They work in harmony for proper functioning of organ and systems. Now let us go for a quiz based on this lecture. In this quiz, you will be provided an MCQ with four options. You have to find the most accurate one. Our first question is, the number of basic tissues of our body is 4, 5, 3, 2. 4 is the correct option. The lining epithelium of the esophagus is squamous, stratified squamous, non-keratinized, stratified squamous, keratinized, stratified squamous, or keratinized. The correct option is B, stratified squamous, non-keratinized, because the function is protection. So it is stratified squamous, non-keratinized. Non-keratinized because of the fact that this epithelium continuously comes in contact with the secretions. It comes continuously in contact with the water, so it is non-keratinized. Urothelium is which type of epithelium? Squamous, stratified squamous, non-keratinized, stratified squamous, keratinized, transitional. The correct option is D. Urothelium is also called the transitional epithelium. Vasa vasorum is well developed in artery, vein, both none. It is well developed in the vein than arteries as already explained. Which layer of stratified epithelium gives nomenclature to this epithelium? Most superficial layer, basal layer, intermediate layer, second layer. The most superficial layer in case of stratified epithelium gives nomenclature to this epithelium. Which of the following is functionally most active epithelium? Squamous, cuboidal, columnar, stratified squamous. As already explained, columnar is the most active epithelium. This type of epithelium is found in the gut, where the function is either secretion or absorption. It is also found stratum basale of epidermis, which is metabolically a most active layer of the epidermis. Skin is lined by which type of epithelium? A. Stratified squamous epithelium keratinized. B. Squamous epithelium. C. Stratified squamous non-keratinized. D. Stratified squamous or keratinized. A is the correct option. Which of the following is not a striated muscle? Caudate, skeletal, muscularis mucosa, muscles in the upper third of the esophagus. There is no doubt between the caudate and skeletal muscle, both are striated. Now remains the C, muscularis mucosa. Muscularis mucosa is basically the smooth muscle of the gut, so it is non-striated. Muscles in the upper third of the esophagus. Esophagus in upper third has skeletal muscle, in the middle it is mixed, in the lower third it is smooth. So in the upper third we have skeletal, so striated muscle. The ratio between the number of pre and post ganglion nerve fibers is about 1 is to 111, 1 is to 140, 1 is to 200, 1 is to 164. This question I have taken from the Gray's Anatomy. The exact ratio mentioned there is 1 is to 164. Which of the following are not present in brain? Astrocytes, oligodendrocytes, ependymal cell, Schwann cell. Schwann cells are not present in the brain. They are present in the peripheral nervous system. Thank you for watching this video. Do not forget to like, subscribe and share this video.